Listen closely, because this is the part they never put in the report. There are rules in the Navy that exist to keep you alive. And there are rules that exist to keep something else alive. Something that doesn't have a pulse, but has a chain of command. Midnight. Virginia. Category 2 rain turning the highway into a moving grave. My hands were locked on the wheel of a Navy supply truck, knuckles white, wipers beating like a failing heart monitor. 16 hours on the road. 30 miles from Norfolk. The kind of exhaustion where your thoughts start to blur at the edges and you begin to trust the manual more than your instincts. The manual was right there in the glove box. Standing order. Classified transport. No unauthorized stops. No civilian contact. No exceptions. That's how they write it, clean, confident, absolute. The kind of language that makes a man feel safe. Or makes him feel owned. Then I saw the hazard lights. 2 weak orange flashes ahead, half drowned by the storm, like a distress signal from another world. At first I told myself it was debris. A down sign. A trick of rain on glass. Because the human mind will lie to you when the truth is inconvenient. But it wasn't debris. It was a dark SUV on the shoulder, hood up, taillights dimming like they were about to die. And a man stepped into the rain, waving both arms like he was trying to stop a train. Behind him, fogged windows. A woman's outline. And smaller, much smaller, a child pressed into the back seat like an animal trying to disappear. Here's the moment they don't understand unless they've lived it. When protocol and conscience collide, you don't hear angels. You hear your own breathing. You hear the engine. You hear the rulebook whispering, keep going. Keep moving. Not your problem. And then you feel something older than obedience rise up inside you. I pulled over. Hazards on. Tires sinking into mud. My boots hit water that flooded instantly, cold and heavy, like the storm was trying to claim me. I walked up to the driver's window and the man leaned out, voice shredded by wind. Engine dead. No signal. Family freezing. The child's eyes were wide in that dim interior, silent, watching me like I was either rescued or another threat. I could have called it in later. That's what cowards do with good intentions. They delay mercy until it's safe. Instead, I told him, stay with your family. I'll check it. Burned wires. Coolant. Hopeless. And still, I didn't leave. Because the first forbidden truth is simple, systems don't care if a child survives a storm. Systems care if you obey. And the moment you choose the child, you become a problem they have to correct. I chained that SUV to the back of my truck like I was towing a secret. Like I was dragging evidence through the rain. And while the storm screamed over the highway, I moved at a crawl, slow, deliberate, knowing with every mile that the real danger wasn't the weather. It was what I had just done to my own life. By the time the motel lights bled through the rain, my nerves were so tight they felt tuned like wire. That's the thing about saving people in a system built on procedure. You don't feel relief when they're safe. You feel exposure. Like you've stepped into the open with a target on your chest and called it virtue. I backed the truck in slowly, unhooked the chains with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and watched the family climb out. The woman held the child like she didn't trust the air itself. The man stood there drenched, trying to look in control, but control was gone. In the storm, every man is equal, rank, money, reputation, none of it matters when the temperature drops and the road turns predatory. He fumbled for his wallet, tried to force cash into my hand. I refused. Not because I was noble. Because taking it would make it a transaction, and transactions create witnesses in the mind. I didn't want him to remember me as a service. I wanted him to remember that someone stopped. He asked my name anyway. I told him. He repeated it like he was filing it away somewhere deep. Then he said something I didn't understand at the time, quiet, almost buried under the weather. You've done more than you know. The kind of line men use when they've seen power up close. Not Hollywood power. Real power. The kind that moves without sound. I got back in the cab, and the moment the engine turned over, guilt hit harder than fear. Not guilt for helping them, guilt for violating the invisible perimeter. Because that's what protocol really is, a perimeter around certain movements, certain cargo, certain schedules, certain people. And once you cross it, the system doesn't ask why. It asks what else you'll cross next. The drive to base felt longer than the entire resupply run. Every mile marker looked like a countdown to consequences. In the mirror, the road disappeared into black water and mist, and I kept imagining headlights behind me that weren't there. Not because I believed in movie conspiracies, but because in the military you learn something civilians don't. Sometimes you're not being paranoid. Sometimes you're just early. Dawn arrived like a weak apology. Fog clung to the gate. The sentry saluted as if nothing in the world had changed. I returned it, soaked, hollow, carrying the kind of secret that isn't classified on paper, only in culture. Inside the logistics hangar, my report went in like any other. Time stamps. Fuel usage. Route completion. No mention of the motel. No mention of the child's hands on the glass. The system only recognizes what you write down. And what you write down becomes your cage. I wanted sleep, a shower, and silence. Instead, there was a note waiting on my desk, already printed like it had been drafted before I even arrived. Report to Captain Briggs. 0700 sharp. No explanation. No conversation. Just the machine turning its gears. And that's the second forbidden truth. When you break protocol, you don't walk into discipline. You walk into the theater. They don't just punish you, they use you. They make your choice into a warning sign so everyone else learns the real lesson. Compassion is a liability. I stood outside Briggs's office with damp cuffs and a dry mouth, realizing I hadn't just towed a family. I'd towed a question into the base. A question that could infect other people. A question the institution was designed to kill. The door clicked open. Lieutenant Hayes, the aide called. You're up. And as I stepped inside, I understood something dark and clarifying. Storms don't end when the rain stops. They end when the system decides you're no longer worth correcting. Captain Briggs didn't return my salute. He let it hang in the air like a man testing how long I'd hold respect for someone who didn't deserve it. His office smelled like burnt coffee and polished wood, comfort for the kind of leader who mistakes rigidity for strength. He slid a document across the desk without looking me in the eye. The paper was already warm, like it had been handled, reviewed, pre-approved. Disobedience of Standing Order 7A. Unauthorized stop. Civilian interaction. Compromised transport integrity. The language was clinical, but the intent was personal. He asked if I knew what it meant. I said yes. I kept my voice low, steady, disciplined. Because in that room, emotion wasn't weakness, it was evidence. He leaned back, satisfied, and told me I jeopardized classified cargo and compromised the timeline. I told him there was a family stranded in a storm. A child. The pen in his hand stopped moving, then struck the desk like a gavel. A child does not override Navy protocol. That sentence is how institutions reveal themselves. Not with cruelty, but with certainty. The tone of a man who's never had to pay for his own decisions. He wasn't defending safety. He was defending the chain. The idea that orders are sacred even when reality is drowning. He reassigned me to base operations. Desk duty. Paperwork. No convoys, no field missions. The soft exile they give you when they don't want a court-martial, they want a lesson. I said, yes, sir, because the uniform teaches you to swallow things that should choke you. As I turned to leave, I caught Lieutenant Miller in the doorway, smirking with a coffee mug like this was entertainment. Tough break, Hayes, he murmured. Next time, save the world on your own time. I didn't respond. The silence was cleaner than any argument. The operations office was a fluorescent aquarium. Rows of screens. Printer ink. Stale air. People typing like they were trying to drown out their own thoughts. My new supervisor slid forms toward me and told me to keep my head down. People talk. That's not advice. That's a warning. Because in controlled environments, gossip is enforcement. It keeps the herd aligned without the leaders getting blood on their hands. Days turned into a routine designed to sand down the edges of a person. Inventory data. Route logs. Efficiency reports. And every time I saw cargo planes rolling out on the tarmac, something in me tightened, not jealousy, but the sensation of being caged for choosing to be human. A week later, Briggs made it public. He held up my reprimand in a briefing like it was scripture. This is what happens when protocol is ignored. Logistics is not charity. It's precision. He didn't need to say my name. The room knew. Men shifted in their seats, eyes avoiding mine, because nobody wants to be caught sympathizing with a condemned soldier. Sympathy is contagious. And fear is the vaccine. Afterward, an older mechanic, Chief Morales, found me near the hangar. Oil still on his hands, decades in his face. He told me he'd stopped a convoy once and saved a kid from a wreck, got written up too. Sometimes the uniform forgets it's worn by people, he said, and then walked off like he dropped a knife into my pocket. That night, I ran the base perimeter until my lungs burned, trying to outrun the image of that child staring through rain-streaked glass. I wasn't proud. I wasn't heroic. I was just someone who couldn't drive past. And the punishment wasn't really about the stop. It was about what the stop represented, independent moral judgment. The one thing every system fears, because it makes men harder to program. 2 weeks passed. My conduct is spotless. My reports are perfect. Still, the silence got heavier. Not because I regretted what I did, because I started to realize how many men live their entire lives obeying and call it honor when it's really just avoidance. Then, one evening, a runner approached with a clipboard and said the words that tightened the air around me. Lieutenant Hayes. Captain Briggs requests your presence immediately. My pulse spiked, not because I feared Briggs, but because I could feel it. Something had shifted above my pay grade. Something I wasn't supposed to touch. I walked down the corridor, boots echoing, and stepped into Briggs's office again. But the room had changed. There was another chair occupied now. A man rose as I entered, gray hair, calm eyes, posture like gravity. His uniform carried 4 silver stars. And in that instant, the storm came back in full force, not in the sky, inside me, because I recognized the face behind the rain. The Admiral extended his hand like this was normal, like a 4-star meeting a soap logistics lieutenant was just another item on a schedule. But his eyes didn't match the formality. His eyes carried memory. The kind that doesn't belong in an office. The kind that belongs on the shoulder of a highway with wind trying to rip the world apart. Captain Briggs snapped to attention, suddenly bright, suddenly eager, as if authority were sunlight and he'd been starving. Admiral Warren, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, he said, voice tight with pride. He introduced him to the way men introduce a weapon they intend to hide behind. Briggs didn't notice what I noticed, that faint, controlled recognition in the Admiral's face, the smallest pull at the corner of his mouth, like he was watching an old scene replay from a new angle. "Good morning, Lieutenant," the Admiral said. "I believe we've met before." The room tilted. Not physically. Morally. Because now my stop on Route 58 wasn't a rule violation. It was a thread tied to the top of the hierarchy. And when a thread touches the top, it stops being a private mistake. It becomes a liability or a leverage point, depending on who holds the scissors. Briggs started talking numbers immediately. Efficiency. Schedules. Chain of custody. He performed competence like a man auditioning for salvation. The Admiral barely listened. He let Briggs talk the way a predator lets a prey animal exhaust itself. Then he looked at me again, calmly, and said, "Let's talk about protocol, shall we?" That question wasn't about the manual. It was about my identity. In the Navy, protocol is more than a rule set. It's a psychological control system. It trains you to obey first, justify later. It teaches you that the institution is the parent and you are the child. And if you break a rule, you don't just risk punishment, you risk being labeled unreliable, dangerous, unfit. And the truth is, most men would rather be miserable than be labeled. The Admiral's inspection became the base's new weather. People whispered in hallways like they were in church. Briggs strutted and barked and polished, and the officers who used to ignore me suddenly watched me with a different kind of curiosity, like they couldn't decide if I was about to be crushed or crowned. For 3 days, the Admiral pulled files. Personnel evaluations. Disciplinary records. Case histories. He didn't just want data. He wanted patterns. Because patterns reveal what an institution is really doing. And I began to see what I hadn't wanted to see before. The reprimand wasn't an isolated act. It was part of a culture. A culture that rewards the men who keep the gears turning and punishes the ones who ask if the machine is grinding bones. At noon on the 3rd day, I heard something in passing, quiet voices near the comm station. "He requested the deviation case file," someone said. "The Route 58 incident." Another voice, lower, he asked specifically for Hayes. I didn't eat lunch. I sat at my desk staring at a screen full of inventory numbers that suddenly looked like tombstones. In a way, that's what logistics is when it loses its soul, counting what moves, ignoring who gets crushed. Then the message came through internal comms, report to Command Briefing Room 1. No explanation. No time to prepare. Just gravity pulling me toward the center of the base like I'd been marked. The room was full when I arrived. Captain Briggs stood at the head of the table, senior officers lined up like witnesses. Admiral Warren sat at the far end with a folder in his hands. My folder. Briggs announced, "We're reviewing base operations for procedural discipline." The Admiral wanted an example of field deviation cases. He said it like he was presenting a trophy. Like my punishment was proof of his leadership. The Admiral opened the folder, looked down, then up. This report says you disobeyed standing orders during an active supply transport. Is that correct? Yes, sir. Why? I could have lied. I could have wrapped it in regulations and let my conscience suffocate quietly. But something about the Admiral's gaze told me the real test was whether I could speak the truth under pressure. I stopped to assist civilians stranded in a storm, I said. There was a child. Briggs cut in fast, eager to regain control. The infraction was clear-cut, Admiral. She jeopardized cargo integrity and violated chain of command. The Admiral closed the folder slowly, like he was sealing a coffin. Then he asked the question that changed the oxygen in the room. Was any cargo lost? No, sir, Briggs admitted. Was anyone injured? No, sir. Was the mission completed? Yes, sir. The Admiral nodded once. Then the only failure here was moral judgment. He let the silence stretch until it hurt. Yours or hers, Captain? I'm still deciding which. That was when I realized the real battlefield wasn't the road in the storm. It was this room. Because in front of witnesses, power had to choose what it worshipped, procedure or principle. And the room went so still you could hear men thinking about their own lives. Briggs tried to speak, but his throat betrayed him. That's what happens when a man builds his identity on authority and then authority turns its face away. The Admiral stood, slow and controlled, and his presence filled the room without a single raised word. Leadership, he said, isn't measured by who follows orders. It's measured by who can make the right call when orders fall short. Then he looked directly at me. Would you make the same decision again? There are moments when your entire future balances on how convincingly you can betray yourself. I felt every eye in the room on me, watching for hesitation, watching for the reflexive obedience they'd been trained to respect. But I'd already crossed the perimeter once. I wasn't going to crawl back inside it for comfort. Yes, sir, I said. I'd make it again. The Admiral nodded once, a small motion with the weight of a verdict. He gathered the folder and walked out. No speech. No performance. Just a door closing with a quiet click that sounded like the end of someone's career. Briggs didn't move for a long second. The other officers avoided his eyes like they were watching a man lose blood in public. I saluted, turned, and left without a word. Outside, the sunlight hit the courtyard hard, almost offensive after the cold tension of that room. Everything looked normal, sailors crossing paths, engines whining in the distance, flags snapping in the wind. That's the cruel beauty of institutions, they don't look evil. They look orderly. By noon the base was buzzing, but nobody had facts. They never do. In a controlled environment, information is rationed like water. The less you know, the less you can resist. Men filled the blanks with rumor, and rumor did what it always does, made the invisible feel real. The next morning, an email hit my inbox marked urgent, report to the Admiral's quarters at 1000. Not Briggs. Not base operations. The Admiral's quarters. The place you don't go unless you're being rewarded or erased. I walked through corridors I'd never been allowed to enter, past doors guarded by silence and seniority. The air felt cleaner up there, like the building itself had different rules. I knocked. Enter, came the voice inside. Calm. Unhurried. The same voice that had pulled a room full of officers into stillness without raising its volume. The Admiral's quarters were lined with maps and framed photographs, ships, crews, ceremonies, the curated mythology of service. He stood by the window looking out over the bay like he was watching something deeper than water. He turned when I entered, studied me for a beat, then gestured to a chair. At ease, Lieutenant, he said. Not kindly. Precisely. Like he was deciding what kind of man I was, even though I wasn't a man. He opened my personnel file and read it like a man confirming a diagnosis. 12 years service. Commendations. Crisis logistics. No disciplinary actions until Route 58. Then he asked the question that mattered. Tell me about that night. I told him. Simple. Direct. No ornament. A family stranded. No signal. Storm. Tow to safety. Protocol violated. Then he asked why. I said, because doing nothing felt worse than breaking a rule. The Admiral was silent for so long I could hear the buildings hum. Then he said it, quietly, like he was placing a loaded weapon on the table between us. That family was mine. The room narrowed to a point. Every sound vanished except my own heartbeat. He continued, voice steady, eyes fixed on me. His daughter and grandson had been driving back from D.C. They wanted to surprise him. Their car died in the storm. Hypothermia was approaching. He had warned them, but warnings don't stop weather, and titles don't stop cold. You found them before the storm did, he said. I couldn't speak. My mouth opened and no words came out, because suddenly the whole situation inverted. My act wasn't just mercy. It was contact, unintended, unsanctioned contact, with the bloodline of high command. And now you get the deeper truth, it was never about the SUV. It was about access. About who is allowed to touch who. Institutions don't just protect secrets. They protect distance. They protect the illusion that the people at the top are untouchable, unreachable, separate from the weather that kills ordinary families. The Admiral looked at me like he was seeing a memory and a future at the same time. You didn't know who they were, he said. But you stopped anyway. That's why it matters. Then he pressed the intercom button. Send in Captain Briggs. And I understood the next layer of the descent. This wasn't going to be a quiet correction. This was going to be a public realignment. A signal sent down the chain. Right then, halfway through this story, I need you to do something. Comment the phrase storm compass twice, storm compass, storm compass. Not for me. For you. Because a man who can say it publicly is admitting he's the kind of man who won't let systems replace conscience. The door opened. Briggs stepped in. Stiff posture. Controlled face. But his eyes flicked to me sitting there, and the confidence drained out of him like water through a crack. The next morning, I walked into the briefing room with a different weight on my shoulders. Not rank, responsibility. When the institution punishes you, it's simple, stay quiet, survive, keep your head down. But when it suddenly elevates you, the danger becomes subtler. Now you're expected to represent the very system that tried to erase you. Now you're expected to turn your private compass into official doctrine without losing your soul in the process. The Admiral sat at the head of the table, calm as stone, while officers filed in with the careful posture of men who'd learned that one wrong expression could become a career-ending screenshot. He didn't start with speeches about patriotism. He started with files. He laid out disciplinary records like crime scene photos and asked questions that made people shift in their seats. How many reprimands were issued for unauthorized humanitarian contact? How many were tied to weather events, accidents, civilian risk? How often did officers choose the manual over the moment and then call it discipline? The answers came back slippery, defensive, sanitized. That's the fourth forbidden truth. The system trains men to speak in a way that hides reality while sounding responsible. It's not lying. It's worse. It's linguistic anesthesia. It keeps the conscience asleep. The Admiral looked around the room and said, numbers tell stories. People tell the truth. Then he did something that felt almost illegal in its simplicity. He told them why he was here. Not my name. Not the storm. The principle. No procedure will ever outweigh the value of a human life, he said. If it does, your procedure is broken. You could feel some of the older officers resist it, not because they disagreed, but because agreement would force them to revisit memories they'd locked away, times they kept driving, times they chose not to see the stranded car, the injured body, the screaming that wasn't their job. Men protect their self-image like a fortress. If the fortress cracks, everything floods. Then the Admiral announced a directive, a formal protection for officers who render aid under adverse conditions if lives are saved and mission integrity remains intact. A Samaritan policy. He didn't call it mercy. He called it judgment. Because mercy sounds soft, and soft gets dismissed. But judgment is power. Judgment is what separates a man from a machine. And yet even as the room nodded, I watched the eyes. Some were inspired. Others were already looking for loopholes. Because institutions adapt. They don't surrender. They learn how to appear changed while keeping their original spine intact. They replace the old punishment with new metrics, new forms, new ways to trap you in paperwork until your courage becomes too expensive to use. After the meeting, Morales caught me in the corridor and said, "Be careful, ma'am." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Every veteran knows this truth. When you embarrass a system, it doesn't always strike you from the front. It waits. It smiles. It lets time do the work. That afternoon, I went through supply manifests and convoy schedules, but I started noticing patterns that had never bothered me before. Routes that made no sense except on paper. Deliveries that were always urgent but never explained. Cargo categories that were tagged with vague labels that created authority without clarity. The system loves vagueness. Vagueness creates obedience. When men don't understand, they default to compliance, and compliance is the raw material of control. I thought about that night again, about how quickly a simple stop became a base-wide lesson. One decision on a shoulder of wet asphalt had exposed two worlds living inside the same uniform, the world of rules and the world of reality. The world of paperwork and the world of a child's cold hands on glass. That's when I realized the story people were telling about me wasn't the real story. The real story was about how easily a man's moral instincts can be trained out of him, and how rare it is to find someone who still has them intact. The Navy didn't just test my obedience. It tested whether I'd accept humiliation as the price of belonging. And now, with this policy shift, the question became darker: would the institution truly allow conscience, or would it simply rebrand conscience as approved so it could be monitored, audited, controlled? Because once something is official, it becomes trackable. Once it's trackable, it becomes punishable again, just under a different name. That night, I stood by the seawall and watched the water move like black glass. The storm had passed weeks ago, but something inside me was still listening for thunder. I understood that what I'd stumbled into wasn't just a leadership moment. It was a glimpse behind the curtain, how quickly narrative is shaped, how quickly a person can be made into a symbol, and how symbols are used to program everyone watching. Somewhere out there, another officer would face a stranded family in the dark. If he remembered this story, would he stop because it was right, or because it was now allowed? And if the only reason he stopped was permission, what kind of man was he becoming? A week after the new directive, the base looked calmer on the surface: salutes, schedules, polished boots, the same daily theater, but underneath, the atmosphere had changed. When an institution is forced to admit it was wrong, it doesn't just correct the rule. It studies the person who exposed the weakness. It measures you. It categorizes you. Are you loyal? Are you unstable? Are you useful? Are you contagious? That's the word they never say out loud, but you feel it: contagious. Because courage spreads the same way fear does. One man refuses to be programmed, and suddenly other men start remembering they have a spine. My new responsibilities came with new access. Not the glamorous kind. The dangerous kind. The kind where you start seeing the seams. I reviewed route approvals, cargo classifications, and incident reports. And I noticed how often security was used as a blanket to hide not secrets from enemies, but decisions from scrutiny. Security isn't just protection. It's insulation. It keeps questions out. It keeps accountability away. In the old days, kings used priests and ritual. Modern institutions use acronyms and stamped forms. Same outcome, the average man is trained to believe the system is too complex to challenge, too sacred to question. So he obeys. And he calls his obedience virtue. Then I found a file that didn't belong where it was. A simple discrepancy on a manifest, 1 digit off, 1 signature missing. It would have been easy to ignore, easy to chalk up to clerical error. But when you've been punished for 1 stop in a storm, you learn a strange skill. You learn to pay attention to small things. Small things are how big lies survive. I traced the discrepancy back through the chain. The cargo category was vague, the routing odd, the urgency exaggerated. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't medical supplies. It was equipment. Sensitive equipment. The kind that gets moved under cover of routine logistics so nobody asks why it's going where it's going. And suddenly the storm night took on a new shadow. The rule about no civilian contact during classified transport wasn't only about protecting information. It was also about protecting deniability. Because civilians create variables. Civilians create witnesses. Civilians create the chance that someone might see a piece of the machine while it's moving. I didn't have proof of anything sinister. I had a pattern. And patterns are the beginning of forbidden knowledge. They're the moment your mind stops accepting official explanations as the full story. They're the moment you start seeing that the manual isn't just a safety guide, it's a psychological fence. And the fence isn't there to keep you safe. It's there to keep you inside. That realization messes with you. It changes the way you hear words like protocol and compliance. It changes the way you look at a superior officer's calm face when he says, just follow the procedure. Because procedure is often where responsibility goes to die. I started asking questions carefully, the way you handle live ammunition. Not accusations. Not challenges. Just questions that forced clarity. And you can tell everything you need to know about an institution by how it reacts to clarity. Healthy systems welcome it. Sick systems punish it. Some people answered me like professionals. Others got defensive immediately, as if a question was an attack. One senior chief told me quietly, "Commander, you're stepping into areas that aren't meant for curiosity." He said it like advice. It landed like a threat. That night, I drove home and noticed a car behind me for 3 turns. Could have been nothing. Probably nothing. But the feeling returned, the one I'd felt after the motel, staring into the mirror and imagining headlights. When you start tugging at threads, your mind starts scanning for the hands that tied them. Here's the 5th forbidden truth: most control isn't enforced with violence. It's enforced with uncertainty. With the sense that you might be watched, you might be misunderstood, you might be labeled. And the moment a man starts self-censoring, the system has already won without lifting a finger. I stood in my kitchen in the dark, listening to the refrigerator hum, and realized the storm hadn't been the initiation. The initiation was what came after, the subtle, creeping awareness that the institution didn't just test obedience in emergencies. It tested curiosity in peacetime. And curiosity is the enemy of quiet corruption. Because corruption doesn't always look like villains in a room. Sometimes it looks like normal men, doing normal work, hiding abnormal truths behind normal paperwork. Once you start seeing the seams, you can't unsee them. That's the curse and the gift. The curse is paranoia. The gift is precision. Men who master themselves learn to separate instinct from imagination, but they also learn to respect the moment instinct first wakes up, because that's usually when a truth has entered the room. The Samaritan policy made headlines inside the base, but outside, nothing changed. No press release. No public celebration. The institution doesn't like broadcasting moral corrections. It prefers the myth that it was always right. Admitting error invites civilians to ask what else has been wrong for decades. And that's a question the machine is built to avoid. I kept working, kept reviewing manifests, kept rebuilding the culture the Admiral wanted, one where officers weren't punished for saving lives. But I watched how quickly the system tried to metabolize the directive into another compliance ritual. New forms appeared. New checklists. New required briefings. Humanitarian contact documentation. Risk mitigation attestations. They wrapped decency in bureaucracy until it began to feel like a special privilege instead of a natural duty. That's how control evolves. First they forbid mercy. Then they allow it, but only if you fill out the right paperwork. They turn a moral impulse into a regulated behavior, and once it's regulated, they can revoke it whenever they want. The man who needs permission to do the right thing is half-owned already. A month later, I got a quiet invitation to a closed-door leadership roundtable. No formal agenda. Just a few senior officers, one civilian liaison, and a projector showing organizational resilience. The language was smooth. The smiles were smooth. And the questions they asked me weren't about logistics. They were about my psychology. How I handle stress. How I make decisions under pressure. Whether I feel conflicted about authority. It was framed as mentorship. It felt like profiling. They wanted to know if I was the kind of officer who could be trusted near sensitive routes, sensitive cargo, sensitive people. They wanted to know if the storm incident had been a one-time moral flare, or the first sign of a man or woman who might refuse future silence. I answered carefully, not like a defendant, but like a strategist. I spoke about balancing mission success with human life, about judgment under uncertainty. I kept my voice calm, my posture steady. Because when you're being evaluated by a system that fears conscience, the worst thing you can do is look emotional. Emotion gives them an excuse to label you unstable. Stability keeps the argument on principle. After the round table, one of the civilians approached me in the hallway. He wasn't military, no rank, no insignia, just a plain suit and a polite face. He said quietly, "You did the right thing that night. But understand, some actions create ripples that reach places you don't see." Then he walked away before I could ask his name. That's when it clicked. I wasn't just inside a base. I was inside a network. Logistics is the bloodstream of power. Whoever controls movement controls outcomes, where resources go, who gets rescued, who gets left behind, which regions recover, which stay broken long enough to be bought cheap, rebuilt by the right contractors, governed by the right policies. You want a mythic dark history? Here it is, hidden in plain sight. Empires don't conquer first with soldiers. They conquer with supplies. With transport. With access. With aid. The oldest trick in the book is to arrive as help and leave as owner. And suddenly, my stop in the storm wasn't just a moral story. It was a disruption of flow. An unplanned deviation in a system that worships predictability. A tiny act of free will inside a machine designed to eliminate it. I looked back at the night on Route 58 with new eyes. Not as a random crisis. As a moment where two realities brushed against each other, the human world and the institutional world. The human world cares about a freezing child. The institutional world cares about routes, timetables, and the invisible cargo of influence. And now I understood why Briggs reacted the way he did. He wasn't just a rigid man. He was a guardian of predictability. Men like him don't climb because they're brilliant. They climb because they're safe. They don't improvise. They don't question. They don't create legal exposure by interacting with civilians when the wrong cargo is moving. When the Admiral relieved Briggs, it looked like justice. But deeper down, it was also a message: loyalty to humanity is tolerated, sometimes even rewarded, if it doesn't threaten the larger machine. The moment it threatens the larger machine, the reward turns into a collar. I stood at the pier again that night, watching darkness thicken over the water, and I felt something settle in my chest, a quiet, hard resolve. I could live as a symbol, used to inspire compliance dressed as compassion. Or I could live as a man with a compass, willing to accept the cost of seeing clearly. Because the final descent isn't learning that systems can be corrupt. Everybody suspects that. The final descent is learning exactly how corruption stays clean, through language, through procedure, through the careful training of good men to doubt their own instincts. There's a reason the storm stays with you long after the road dries. It isn't the rain. It's the moment you discover you have two loyalties living inside your chest, and only one of them will be rewarded by the world. Loyalty to the institution feels safe. Loyalty to your conscience feels lonely. But loneliness is where real power is forged, because it means you've stopped needing the crowd's permission to be a man. The Admiral's Samaritan directive became policy, then training material, then a story told to new officers like a campfire myth meant to keep morale warm. And that's exactly how the machine neutralizes dangerous truths. It turns them into inspiration. Inspiration is safe. Inspiration makes men feel brave without requiring them to act brave. It becomes a poster, not a practice. I watched it happen in real time. I saw young officers quote the policy like scripture, then freeze when the real world demanded judgment without a checklist. I saw senior leaders nod solemnly during briefings, then privately warn people not to make a habit of deviations. The words changed. The incentives didn't. That's the oldest corruption on earth: public virtue, private control. And I understood something that would have broken me if I wasn't ready to carry it: institutions don't fear evil men. Evil men are predictable. They fear good men who can't be bought, because good men introduce uncertainty into systems designed to run without friction. A man with a conscience can't be fully automated. The storm night taught me how quickly a person can become a case file. How compassion can be reframed as risk. How saving a family can be rewritten as compromising transport integrity. That is psychological control in its purest form. Rename the moral act until it sounds like a threat. Once it sounds like a threat, men police themselves. So here's what I want you to take from this, and I'm going to speak to you like a mentor, not a storyteller. If you're a man watching this, 18 or 69, it doesn't matter. Your life is full of protocols. Company policies. Unspoken rules. Family expectations. Social punishments. The invisible hand that pushes you to keep driving when you should stop. The invisible voice that says, "Not your problem." That voice isn't always evil. Sometimes it's survival. But sometimes it's programming. The difference between a disciplined man and a controlled man is one question: can you choose correctly when no one is watching and the rules aren't enough? Because the rules will never cover every moment. They can't. Life is too chaotic. And that gap, the gap between procedure and reality, is where your character actually lives. That's the hidden agenda behind most perfect systems. They don't want you to have a character that functions without supervision. They want you to be predictable. They want you to be manageable. They want you to need permission. When I stopped on that shoulder, I didn't know the father was an admiral. And that was the point. That's what made the act pure. No incentive. No reward. No career advantage. Just a decision made in the dark, under pressure, with the kind of clarity that only arrives when comfort is stripped away. And yes, power intervened. Justice arrived in a quiet office with 4 silver stars. But don't miss the darker lesson. If that man had been nobody, if that family had been ordinary, the system would have happily used me as a warning sign and moved on. That's not cynicism. That's pattern recognition. And pattern recognition is what separates the awake from the obedient. So if you commented Storm Compass twice earlier, understand what you did. You didn't just feed an algorithm. You marked yourself as the kind of man who chooses the compass over the crowd. The kind of man who would rather be right than approved. The storm is coming for all of us in one form or another. Not always rain. Sometimes it's a layoff, a divorce, a betrayal, a sick parent, a moral choice that shows you who you really are. And when it hits, the only thing you'll have that can't be taken from you is the part of you that still knows the difference between protocol and purpose. Remember this, the most dangerous knowledge isn't a secret document. It's the realization that your conscience is a weapon if you stop letting the world turn it into a liability.